May 4th, 2007. A small farming town in southwest Kansas. Population just under 1,400 people. The kind of town where the biggest tourist attraction is a hole in the ground, the world's largest hand-dug well, and where most nights end quietly. Porch lights switching off one by one. The highway through town gone still by 9 o'clock. May 4th, 2007 did not end quietly. Before the night was over, this town would be wiped almost completely off the map, and it would happen in under 10 minutes. To understand what came for Greensburg, you have to go back a few hours earlier to the afternoon skies over the Texas Panhandle. That's where the parent storm system was born. A supercell thunderstorm that crossed into Oklahoma and then pushed north into Kansas, feeding on warm, moist air pulled up from the south and violent wind shear tearing through the atmosphere overhead. Meteorologists watching the radar that evening saw something that made their stomachs drop. This wasn't a storm that was going to produce one tornado and move on. It was cycling, building a tornado, weakening it, then building another one, again and again, like the atmosphere itself couldn't stop reloading. Before the night was over, that single supercell would spawn more than a dozen separate tornadoes across the region. Only one of them would become the monster that found Greensburg. By early evening, the system had crossed into Kansas and intensified further. Lightning cracked almost continuously across the horizon. Then came the hail, some of it reportedly the size of baseballs, hard enough to shatter windshields on the open highway. Drivers pulled off the road wherever they could find shelter. One man driving nearby that evening had his windshield caved in by the hail and ducked into a gas station for cover, only to be told by the clerk that something far worse than hail was closing in. He and several strangers who'd wandered in off the highway crowded into the store's walk-in cooler together. Complete strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dark and the cold. That single decision, made in a matter of seconds, would save every one of their lives. Around 9 p.m., the supercell produced its first tornado of the night just southwest of Greensburg in Comanche County. Storm chasers and trained spotters on the ground were already radioing in warnings, describing a funnel that was touching down and growing larger by the second, wider than anything most of them had personally witnessed. It moved northeast, directly toward the town. It did not weaken the way most tornadoes eventually do. It grew. In Greensburg itself, the sirens started wailing. That same familiar wail that had sounded across this stretch of Kansas dozens of times before without incident. For a town used to spring storms, this wasn't unusual at first. Some residents assumed, like they had so many times before, that this was another false alarm, a funnel spotted somewhere out in open country that would dissipate long before it ever reached town. The sirens usually stopped after a few minutes. This time, they didn't stop. 10 minutes went by, then more. One resident later described standing in her yard, half convinced this was routine, slowly realizing from the sheer length of the alarm alone that something about tonight was different. At the local television stations, meteorologists were staring at the same radar returns with mounting alarm. Doppler data out of Dodge City was showing what's known as a debris signature, the unmistakable radar fingerprint of solid material. Roofing, siding, entire structures being lofted high into the air. The National Weather Service made a call they almost never make. Instead of issuing a routine tornado warning, they escalated straight to a tornado emergency, the rarest and most urgent classification that exists, reserved only for situations where a violent, likely deadly tornado is bearing down directly on a populated area. Residents of Greensburg ended up with somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of lead time before impact. In the world of tornado forecasting, that amount of warning is close to unheard of. It would turn out to be the single biggest reason this story wasn't even worse than it already was. Local meteorologist Dave Freeman stayed on air the entire time, tracking the storm's exact path in real time and urging Greensburg residents, by name, street by street, to get underground immediately. Survivors would later credit that broadcast directly with saving their lives. People who might have hesitated, who might have stepped outside first just to see the sky for themselves, instead moved straight for their basements, because a familiar voice on their television told them, without a trace of hesitation, that this was the real thing, and that there was no time left to wait and see. 9:03 p.m. The tornado touched down in open country south of town, and it began to grow at a rate that unsettled even experienced storm chasers standing close enough to film it. Footage recorded by spotters that night captures the exact moment they realized what they were looking at, their voices climbing in real time as the funnel widened from what looked like a strong tornado into something clearly, unmistakably bigger than anything they'd chased before. It kept widening and widening until it reached 1.7 miles across at its peak, wider from edge to edge than most of the town of Greensburg itself. This was not a funnel anymore. It was a wall of wind and airborne debris nearly 2 miles across, moving north in almost total darkness, wrapped so completely in rain that almost nobody directly in its path could actually see it coming. No dramatic funnel silhouette lit up against a stormy sky, the way tornadoes so often look in daylight footage. Just a deepening blackness swallowing streetlights one after another, block by block, as it crept closer to town. Across Greensburg, families were making split-second decisions that would define the rest of their lives. In one house on the south side, a mother gathered her 3 children and crawled into a small closet tucked beneath the basement stairs, while her husband stayed upstairs a moment too long, transfixed by what he was seeing outside the window. He only broke away and ran for the basement when he watched a neighbor's horse trailer, a multi-ton piece of steel, get lifted clean off the ground and hurled toward his own house. Moments later, the windows exploded inward, the walls shook violently on their foundation, and dirt began raining down through the floorboards above them as winds well over 200 miles an hour tore the roof from over their heads. A local pastor took shelter with his wife and daughter in a small basement bathroom, feeling the air pressure inside the house drop so violently and so suddenly that his ears popped, a physical warning his body understood before his mind fully did, telling him something about this storm was different from every other one he'd sat out in that basement before. His daughter would later describe feeling water suddenly against her back in the pitch darkness and realizing with a jolt of pure fear that whatever was left of the house above them likely no longer had a roof at all. A Kansas state legislator and his teenage daughter climbed into a bathtub in their own basement, expecting a neighbor and her infant son to join them any minute, having invited them over the moment the siren started. The neighbor never made it in time. When the roaring finally stopped, less than 2 minutes after it began, less than 2 minutes to erase an entire town, the two of them dug frantically through the wreckage of what used to be their house, calling out into the darkness and the settling dust, until a flashlight beam finally caught a tiny pair of legs buried beneath the debris. They pulled out a 1-year-old boy, still in his diaper, without a single scratch anywhere on his body. Minutes later, more digging turned up his mother nearby, shaken and dust-covered but alive, and they pulled her out too. At Kiowa County Memorial Hospital, staff had moved every patient they could into the basement the moment the tornado emergency alert came through. Every one of them survived, patients and staff alike, riding out the storm below ground while the building above them was torn apart floor by floor. But when they finally climbed back up the stairs afterward, there was no hospital left to bring anyone back to. The building had been destroyed so completely that emergency crews had to set up a temporary field hospital out of tents and mobile units almost immediately, just to keep treating the wounded who kept arriving from every direction of town, carried in on doors, on truck beds, on whatever could be found. At the town's Mennonite church, the situation turned even more harrowing in the days that followed. Two elderly women had taken shelter together in the church basement as the tornado approached, doing exactly what they'd always been taught to do. In the chaos afterward, in a town where nearly every landmark anyone had ever used to find their way around had simply ceased to exist, nobody realized the two of them were still down there, trapped beneath tons of collapsed debris with no way to dig themselves out. It would take almost 2 full days before someone walking past the ruins finally heard faint voices calling out from somewhere beneath the wreckage. Both women were pulled out alive, dehydrated and badly shaken, but alive, after 48 hours trapped in total darkness beneath a building that no longer had walls or a roof above it. Not everyone in Greensburg was so fortunate. Homes along Main Street, an entire row of them standing side by side, were not simply damaged that night. They were removed entirely, lifted clean off their foundations, anchor bolts and all, and scattered across open fields hundreds of yards away, as though they'd never been built there at all. Investigators studying the wreckage in the weeks afterward pointed to this stretch of Main Street as some of the clearest, most textbook EF5 damage ever formally documented in the United States, the highest possible rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, and notably, the very first EF5 tornado recorded anywhere in the country since that new, more rigorous rating scale had been introduced only 3 months earlier. The town's water tower, a landmark that had stood watch over Greensburg for generations, buckled and crashed to the ground entirely, coming down near the very well it had once towered protectively above. The same hand-dug well that had drawn curious tourists off the highway for decades. The town's small claim to fame, reduced overnight to just one more piece of wreckage among thousands. Downtown, the business district wasn't merely damaged either. It was gone. The grocery store, the local bank, the storefronts that had lined Main Street for 100 years, all reduced in a matter of seconds to unrecognizable piles of brick, twisted steel, and splintered lumber. Residents who walked out into the open the next morning said it looked less like storm damage and more like the entire town had simply been erased overnight and would need to be redrawn from a blank page. Nothing left standing to even orient yourself by. By the time the tornado finally lifted and dissipated, looping strangely back on itself in a pattern that even radar meteorologists found unusual, it had been on the ground for just over an hour, carving a scar nearly 29 miles long across Kiowa County. 95% of the town of Greensburg was damaged or destroyed that night. Not 95% of the homes, 95% of the entire town. Homes and churches and schools and businesses alike, gone in the span of roughly 10 minutes once the funnel actually reached the town limits. Search and rescue crews arriving in the hours afterward braced themselves for the absolute worst. Emergency responders reportedly requested refrigerated trucks large enough to hold hundreds of bodies, certain that a storm of this width and speed, tearing directly through a populated town after dark, must have killed on a massive, almost unthinkable scale. What they found instead, while still a genuine tragedy, was in large part the direct result of those 20 to 30 minutes of warning residents had been given. 11 people lost their lives in Greensburg that night, with a 12th victim later succumbing to his injuries months afterward. 63 more were injured, several of them critically. The same storm system claimed additional lives elsewhere that night too, in the small communities of Hopewell and Maxville, and in neighboring Pratt County, bringing the outbreak's total toll higher still. Given the width of the tornado, the ferocity of the winds, and the fact that it struck directly after dark when visibility was already at its absolute worst, meteorologists and disaster researchers would go on to study Greensburg for years afterward as a defining case study in exactly how much difference early, urgent, unambiguous warning can make. It didn't prevent the tragedy, but it kept the tragedy from becoming something almost unimaginably worse. Among those who did not survive were longtime residents whose names would later be carved into a permanent memorial at the heart of the rebuilt town. Neighbors in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, many of them found in the wreckage of homes and basements that had stood firm through generations of ordinary Kansas storms, before this one finally proved too much, even for them. Search teams worked for days afterward, sifting carefully through debris fields that stretched for miles in every direction. Some victims found within the collapsed remains of their own homes. Others found far from where their houses had ever stood, carried and dropped by winds strong enough to fling entire vehicles like empty cans down city blocks. In the days that followed, the town that had lost nearly everything found itself flooded, almost overnight, with help from every direction. National Guard troops moved in to help secure the wreckage and prevent looting. Thousands of volunteers arrived from across the country within the first week alone to begin the grim, exhausting work of clearing debris by hand and by machine, eventually hauling away more than 800,000 cubic yards of it in total, enough wreckage to fill tens of thousands of dump truck loads, driving in and out of town for months. President George W. Bush visited in person just days after the tornado, walking slowly through streets that had been reduced to open, empty fields, later returning a full year afterward to deliver the commencement address at the local high school's graduation ceremony, a ceremony that, like so much else in Greensburg that year, had to be held somewhere other than where it was originally supposed to take place, because the building it belonged in no longer existed. But the story of Greensburg didn't end in the wreckage, and it didn't end with grief alone. In the weeks after the disaster, town leaders made a decision that almost nobody would have predicted from a small farming community of 1,400 people in rural Kansas. Instead of simply rebuilding what had been lost, brick for brick, exactly as it stood before, they chose instead to rebuild from the ground up as one of the greenest towns anywhere in America. Wind turbines rose from the same fields where debris had once stretched for miles in every direction. The new hospital, the new schools, the new city buildings, all of it constructed to the highest environmental building standards achievable at the time, with the rebuilt hospital eventually becoming the first in the entire country to run on fully carbon-neutral energy, and the first to use captured rainwater for its plumbing. Today, this one small Kansas town holds more certified green buildings per person than almost anywhere else in the United States, a title nobody in Greensburg ever imagined they'd hold before that Friday night in May. The population never fully recovered to what it once was. Where 1,400 people once lived, roughly 800 call it home today, nearly 2 decades later. Some families who lost absolutely everything that night simply couldn't bring themselves to rebuild in the exact same place and started over somewhere else entirely, unable to look out their new windows and see the same empty lots every morning. But for those who stayed, and for the generations who've grown up there since, Greensburg became something far larger than just a town that survived a tornado. It became living proof of what a community chooses to do with the wreckage it's left holding, once the wind has finally moved on, and the only thing left to do is decide what comes next. A wall of wind nearly 2 miles wide erased this town from the map in under 10 minutes on an ordinary Friday night in May. And the people who lived through it, who dug their neighbors out of basements and pulled babies from beneath collapsed houses, made a quiet decision in the days that followed. If they were going to build their town back at all, they weren't simply going to rebuild what had been lost. They were going to build something the wind could never take from them again.